Sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones silently praying that just one person will see them instead of their success. On a chilly October evening in downtown Chicago, the amber glow of streetlights spilled across rain-slick sidewalks while the city's endless chorus of traffic hummed beneath towering glass buildings. Inside Bellamy House, one of the city's most elegant restaurants, crystal glasses chimed softly, quiet conversations floated through the air, and polished silver reflected the warm candlelight that danced across every table. At a secluded corner booth sat Victoria Hayes, the 36-year-old CEO of Hayes Technologies, a woman whose name appeared on magazine covers, business networks, and billion-dollar headlines almost every week. Tonight, however, there were no cameras, no board members, and no assistants waiting nearby. There was only a half-finished glass of sparkling water, an untouched dinner growing cold, and tears she could no longer hide. Across from her, an empty chair seemed louder than the crowded restaurant surrounding it. Less than 3 minutes earlier, the man arranged by one of Chicago's most exclusive matchmaking services had stood from that chair with an impatient sigh before saying words that echoed far louder than the orchestra quietly performing across the room. "You're impressive, Victoria. Maybe too impressive. A woman who runs companies doesn't know how to love people." Without another glance, he buttoned his expensive coat, walked away, and disappeared through the revolving doors into the cold autumn night. Victoria stared at the untouched dessert placed between two empty plates. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about quarterly earnings, shareholder meetings, or acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She was wondering why every relationship ended the same way. Was she impossible to love, or had success quietly built walls she could no longer see? She lowered her eyes, fighting back another tear, embarrassed that strangers might notice. At that exact moment, the front entrance opened once more, letting in a rush of crisp evening air carrying the scent of wet leaves and fresh rain. Ethan Brooks stepped inside wearing faded jeans, worn leather work boots, and a clean flannel shirt beneath a weathered canvas jacket. In his hands, he carefully carried a handcrafted walnut table centerpiece commissioned weeks earlier by the restaurant owner. Ethan wasn't there to dine beneath crystal chandeliers. He was there to deliver honest work created after countless late nights in his small woodworking shop while his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, slept upstairs. Every extra dollar mattered. School supplies mattered. Heating bills mattered. Saving for Lily's future mattered. The hostess greeted him warmly and pointed toward the manager near the dining room. As Ethan quietly crossed the restaurant, he noticed a woman sitting alone, her shoulders trembling ever so slightly. He didn't recognize the face that financial magazines called America's youngest self-made female billionaire. He didn't see a powerful CEO whose signature could reshape industries overnight. He simply saw someone whose heart had been broken in public. Without realizing it, two lonely lives had entered the same room, and before this quiet evening was over, neither of them would ever see the world quite the same way again. The restaurant manager smiled with relief as Ethan carefully placed the handcrafted walnut centerpiece onto the reception counter. The rich grain caught the candlelight, glowing with quiet warmth that no machine could have replicated. "Beautiful work, Ethan," the manager said softly. "You always make this place feel more like home." Ethan offered a modest smile and brushed a trace of sawdust from his sleeve. "I'm glad it turned out the way you hoped." As the manager reached for an envelope containing his payment, Ethan's attention drifted once more toward the woman sitting alone. She had not touched her dinner. Her shoulders remained perfectly straight, as though years of discipline refused to let heartbreak bend them completely. Yet her eyes revealed an exhaustion that no expensive suit could hide. The manager followed Ethan's glance and lowered his voice. "Tough night over there. Poor lady got stood up, or something close to it." Ethan nodded gently, without asking another question. Everyone carried burdens that deserved privacy. He slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket and turned toward the exit, but before he reached the revolving door, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "Excuse me." He stopped and looked back. Victoria stood beside her table, one hand resting lightly on the chair, her expression composed even though traces of tears still shimmered in her eyes. "Would you mind sitting down for just 10 minutes?" she asked. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, I think you have mistaken me for someone else." A faint smile crossed her face for the first time that evening. "No, I know exactly who you are. You are the only person in this restaurant who looked at me with concern instead of curiosity." Ethan hesitated. His mind immediately drifted to Lily waiting at home with Mrs. Donnelly, the elderly neighbor who watched her whenever he worked late. He checked the time on his old wristwatch. There was enough time. Barely. He slowly pulled out the chair across from Victoria. 10 minutes, he said politely. "Then I have to get home to my daughter." Her eyebrows lifted with genuine interest. "You have a daughter?" 8 years old, Ethan answered, unable to hide the quiet pride in his voice. "She keeps me busier than any full-time job ever could." Victoria almost laughed, but emotion caught in her throat instead. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Around them, waiters moved gracefully between tables, glasses clinked softly, and a jazz trio near the fireplace eased into an old melody that seemed to wrap the room in gentle comfort. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the tall windows while downtown Chicago shimmered beneath reflections of red brake lights and golden street lamps. Finally, Victoria folded her hands together and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "Can I ask you something strange?" "You can ask." "When you saw me crying?" She paused, searching for the right words. "Did you wonder how much money I had?" Ethan answered almost immediately. "No." She tilted her head. "Not even for a second." He shook his head. Heartbreak sounds exactly the same whether someone lives in a studio, apartment, or the biggest house in the city. Victoria stared at him in complete silence. Every man she had dated had asked what she owned, where she traveled, or how powerful her company had become. No one had ever answered her that way. Something inside the carefully guarded walls around her heart shifted almost imperceptibly. For the first time in many years, she felt as though someone had spoken to the woman she had been long before the headlines ever learned her name. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment, almost embarrassed by the silence that had settled between them. It was not an awkward silence. It was gentle, the kind that asked for nothing and judged even less. She slowly pushed the untouched dessert toward the center of the table. "Would you help me with this?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at the slice of chocolate cake and smiled faintly. "I should probably not. My daughter would never forgive me if I ate good dessert without her." Victoria laughed, a genuine laugh this time, soft enough to surprise even herself. "She sounds like a smart little girl." "She definitely keeps me honest," Ethan replied. "Her name is Lily. Every Friday, we bake something together. Usually cookies. Sometimes they burn. She says burned cookies still deserve to be loved." Victoria rested her chin lightly on her hand as she listened. There was no performance in his voice, no attempt to impress her. Every sentence felt lived instead of rehearsed. "Where is Lily's mother?" she asked carefully. Ethan looked toward the rain sliding down the restaurant windows. His answer came without bitterness. "She passed away 5 years ago after a long illness. We had every reason to give up, but she kept smiling until the very end. She used to tell me that our daughter should grow up remembering laughter instead of sadness." Victoria noticed the quiet strength with which he spoke. His grief had not disappeared. It had simply become part of the man he was. That must have been incredibly hard. Ethan nodded once. "Some days still are. But every morning Lily reminds me there's another reason to get out of bed." Victoria felt something tighten inside her chest. She had spent years sitting across polished conference tables where people negotiated billion-dollar contracts without showing emotion. Yet this ordinary father had spoken one simple sentence that carried more truth than any speech she had ever heard. She looked down at her hands before speaking again. "Can I tell you something I have never told anyone on a first meeting?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "Only if you want to." She inhaled slowly. "People think I have the perfect life. They assume money solves loneliness. They imagine success means someone is always waiting for you at home." She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "The truth is, I have more empty rooms than conversations. I have more business dinners than family dinners. Every relationship eventually becomes a negotiation. They either fall in love with my position or they run away from it. Ethan listened without interrupting. Outside, the rain became steadier, washing the streets below into rivers of reflected city lights. Inside the restaurant, candles flickered gently, as if protecting the quiet moment they shared. Victoria finally whispered the words she had carried alone for years. Sometimes I wonder whether anyone would choose me if I had nothing. Ethan looked at her for several long seconds before answering. His voice remained calm, steady, and free of sympathy that might have sounded like pity. I think the better question is whether anyone has ever given you the chance to simply be Victoria. She froze. Every board member called her chief executive officer. Every reporter called her billionaire. Every investor called her visionary. Even her closest acquaintances rarely spoke her first name without attaching success to it. Yet this man, wearing worn boots and carrying sawdust beneath his fingernails, had somehow seen the frightened woman hidden beneath every headline. For the first time in many years, Victoria realized she was no longer afraid of the silence between them, because it no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something honest. Neither of them noticed that nearly 40 minutes had passed until Ethan's phone vibrated gently inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen and smiled. With immediate relief. It was a message from Mrs. Donnelly. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch after finishing her homework. "Take your time." Ethan quietly thanked her in a short reply before slipping the phone away. Victoria watched the small exchange with quiet curiosity. "Your daughter has someone looking after her?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Mrs. Donnelly lives next door. She says she watches Lily, but the truth is Lily keeps her company just as much." Victoria smiled. "That sounds like family." Ethan looked thoughtful for a moment. Sometimes family is simply the people who keep showing up. Those words lingered between them long after he finished speaking. They reminded Victoria of something she had almost forgotten. Loyalty was rarely purchased. It was earned one ordinary day at a time. A waiter approached and politely asked whether they would like fresh coffee before the kitchen closed. Victoria looked toward Ethan. "Would that be all right?" He checked the time once more before nodding. 1 cup. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee soon drifted through the air, mixing with the comforting scent of warm bread and polished cedar from the handcrafted centerpiece Ethan had delivered earlier that evening. Outside, the rain had softened into a gentle drizzle, and reflections of passing taxis shimmered across the wet pavement like scattered ribbons of gold. Victoria wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. "What do you do when you're not building beautiful furniture?" she asked. Ethan chuckled softly. "Mostly I fix things people think are beyond saving. Broken cabinets, old rocking chairs, antique tables. Sometimes people throw away furniture because it is scratched. I think every mark tells part of its story." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You really believe that?" Edo. He smiled gently. "Would become stronger when you understand where it has been instead of pretending it is brand new." She looked down at the grain of the walnut centerpiece across the room. Tiny knots and natural lines ran through its surface, making it more beautiful instead of less. Somehow she understood he was no longer talking about wood. "Have you always been a carpenter?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. "I studied architecture in college. I loved designing spaces where people could feel safe. But life changed. My wife became sick. School loans became hospital bills. Dreams became responsibilities." He shrugged without resentment. "I never finished my degree." Victoria stared at him quietly. She had spent years interviewing graduates from the finest universities, searching for talent through impressive resumes and prestigious awards. Yet the man sitting across from her possessed a quiet wisdom that could never fit onto a single sheet of paper. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered windows again. "Sometimes I miss the dream, but I have never regretted choosing my family." The answer settled deep inside Victoria's heart. She had spent so many years sacrificing birthdays, holidays, friendships, and relationships in pursuit of building an empire that she could no longer remember the last time someone had spoken about family with such peaceful certainty. She hesitated before asking another question. Would you ever want something bigger for yourself? Ethan smiled with calm confidence. Bigger is not always better. I would rather my daughter remember that I was present than remember I was successful. Victoria lowered her eyes, unable to answer immediately. In every interview she had ever given, reporters asked about growth, expansion, market value, and leadership. No one had ever asked whether success still left room for simply being present. As the last few guests quietly left the restaurant and employees began dimming the lights one section at a time, Victoria realized that the most valuable conversation she had experienced in years had taken place with a man who still believed the richest life was measured not by what someone owned, but by who would still be waiting when they finally came home. The grandfather clock near the entrance quietly chimed 10 times, its mellow tone drifting through the nearly empty restaurant like a gentle reminder that every evening eventually came to an end. Ethan slowly stood, slipping his jacket over his shoulders before, offering Victoria a warm but modest smile. I should get home. Lily will probably wake up if I stay away much longer. Victoria nodded, although a small part of her wished the conversation did not have to end. She had attended executive retreats in Switzerland, leadership summits in New York, and private dinners with world leaders. Yet none of them had left her feeling as unexpectedly peaceful as this simple evening with a carpenter who still carried sawdust beneath his fingernails. As Ethan reached for the back of his chair, Victoria quietly asked, "May I see your work someday?" He looked puzzled. "My work? Your workshop?" She smiled softly. "You speak about what the way musicians speak about songs." Ethan laughed under his breath. "It is nothing fancy, just an old garage behind my house. I would still like to see it." He hesitated, unsure why this stranger seemed genuinely interested in something so ordinary. "If you ever find yourself on the north side of the city, you're welcome to stop by. Just promise you will not expect anything impressive." "Maybe I'm tired of impressive," Victoria answered almost in a whisper. Those words lingered in Ethan's thoughts as they walked together toward the restaurant entrance. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the crisp autumn air smelling of damp brick, fresh earth, and fallen maple leaves. Chicago glowed beneath thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon, yet the streets somehow felt quieter than before. A black luxury sedan waited at the curb across the street with its headlights glowing patiently through the mist. Ethan noticed the vehicle but thought little of it. Downtown restaurants attracted successful people every evening. To him, it was simply another expensive car. Victoria followed his gaze and felt a brief moment of concern. She had completely forgotten that her driver had been waiting for nearly an hour after receiving instructions not to interrupt her dinner. She turned back to Ethan before the driver could approach. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "For what?" "For treating me like a person instead of a position." Ethan smiled with the same calm kindness that had quietly dismantled the walls around her heart throughout the evening. "Everyone deserves that." Before Victoria could answer, a little voice echoed inside Ethan's memory. "Burned cookies still deserve to be loved." He smiled to himself. Lily always found ways to simplify truths adults spent years complicating. Ethan extended his hand politely. "Take care of yourself, Victoria." She looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was steady, warm, and completely free of hesitation. There was no attempt to impress her, no hidden expectation, no curiosity about her wealth or influence. Only quiet respect. As Ethan walked toward the nearby parking garage where his aging pickup truck waited, Victoria remained standing beneath the restaurant awning, watching him disappear into the evening crowd. Her driver finally approached. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, "the board has already called 3 times. Tomorrow's merger meeting begins at 8 sharp. Victoria did not immediately respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the sidewalk where Ethan had disappeared among ordinary people returning home after ordinary days. "Cancel my breakfast meeting," she said at last. The driver blinked in surprise. "With the investors?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" Victoria smiled in a way he had not seen for years. Because tomorrow morning, I think I would rather visit a carpenter who believes every scar has a story than spend another hour pretending perfect things are the most valuable. The driver quietly opened the car door, still confused, while somewhere across the city Ethan started the old pickup truck that rattled faithfully to life, completely unaware that the woman he had just comforted was about to step into his simple world, carrying far more questions than answers. And perhaps for the very first time, she was hoping that no one there would recognize her at all. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight that filtered through rows of golden maple trees lining Ethan's quiet neighborhood. Long before most of downtown Chicago had finished its first cup of coffee, Ethan was already sweeping fresh wood shavings from the floor of his modest workshop behind his small white house. The familiar scent of cedar, walnut, and pine filled the cool morning air, while an old country station played softly from a dusty radio perched above a workbench worn smooth by years of honest labor. Inside the house, 8-year-old Lily sat at the kitchen table, finishing a bowl of oatmeal, while carefully coloring a picture of a treehouse she insisted her father would someday build. "Daddy," she called as Ethan stepped inside to refill his coffee mug. "Do you think every tree wants to become something?" Ethan smiled at the unexpected question. "Maybe not every tree." "Then how do you know which one becomes a table or a rocking chair?" she asked. Ethan crouched beside her chair and looked at the drawing. "You do not force it. You listen. Every piece of wood tells you what it was meant to become." Lily nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. "Mom used to say people are like that too." Ethan felt a familiar ache inside his chest, but this time it was softened by gratitude instead of sorrow. She was right. A gentle knock interrupted the quiet morning. Ethan assumed it was Mrs. Donnelly returning the casserole dish she had borrowed over the weekend. Instead, when he opened the front door, he found Victoria standing on the porch wearing blue jeans, simple sneakers, a light brown jacket, and a baseball cap that hid most of her hair. There were no security guards, no photographers, no luxury sedan waiting behind her. Only a modest rental car parked along the curb with a thin layer of fallen leaves gathered around its tires. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "You actually came." Victoria laughed softly. "I told you I wanted to see your workshop." Before Ethan could answer, Lily peeked around the doorway with curious eyes. "Daddy, who is she?" Ethan smiled warmly. "Lily, this is Victoria. We met last night." Victoria bent slightly, so she would be at eye level with the little girl. "It is very nice to meet you." Lily studied her for several thoughtful seconds before extending a tiny hand exactly the way she had seen adults do. "Welcome to our house." Victoria shook her hand, unable to hide her smile. "Thank you." Within minutes, Lily was enthusiastically giving an unofficial tour that included the vegetable garden, a bird feeder she proudly claimed every squirrel secretly loved, and a swing Ethan had built from reclaimed oak. Victoria watched father and daughter move effortlessly around one another, finishing each other's sentences, laughing over tiny jokes that needed no explanation. Nothing about their home was expensive. The porch paint needed touching up. The fence leaned slightly near the back corner. The garden tools showed years of careful use. Yet every corner carried evidence of attention instead of neglect, love instead of luxury. When they finally stepped inside the workshop, morning sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating dozens of carefully crafted pieces waiting for delivery. Victoria slowly ran her fingertips across a beautifully restored rocking chair whose finish glowed with quiet elegance. "This was broken?" she asked in disbelief. Ethan nodded. The owner almost threw it away. "And now?" Ethan smiled gently. "Now it gets another chance." Victoria looked around the workshop in complete silence. For years, she had built companies by replacing what no longer performed well enough. Standing in that humble garage, surrounded by objects rescued instead of discarded, she found herself wondering whether people deserved that same kind of patient restoration, and whether perhaps she had finally found someone who had been quietly practicing that truth all along. The hours slipped by almost unnoticed as Lily insisted that every visitor should help decorate the small birdhouse she and her father had been building for weeks. Victoria found herself sitting at an old wooden table with a tiny paintbrush in her hand, carefully coloring bright blue flowers beneath the roof while Lily offered enthusiastic instructions that changed every few minutes. Ethan watched them from across the workshop while sanding the edge of a walnut bookshelf, smiling each time Lily burst into another fit of laughter. The sound filled the room with something the workshop had not heard in a very long time. Around noon, Ethan carried 3 grilled cheese sandwiches and bowls of tomato soup onto the back porch. It is not exactly a 5-star restaurant, he joked as they settled around the weathered picnic table. Victoria looked at the simple meal before taking a careful bite. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and smiled. I cannot remember the last time lunch tasted this good. Ethan laughed softly. It is probably because somebody else made your meals. Usually, she looked down at her bowl. I spend more lunches signing contracts than actually eating. Lily tilted her head with the straightforward honesty only children possess. Do you work every day? Victoria nadith. Almost. Even on your birthday? Sometimes. Lily frowned as though she had just heard something completely unreasonable. That sounds lonely. The innocent observation settled over the table with surprising weight. Victoria tried to answer, but no words arrived. Ethan gently changed the subject by asking Lily about school, and within seconds a little girl was describing a science project involving butterflies and maple trees. Victoria listened quietly, watching the effortless way Ethan encouraged every story, every question, every dream his daughter shared. He never glanced at a phone. He never hurried her. He treated every sentence as though it mattered. After lunch, Lily ran inside to finish a drawing she wanted to surprise Mrs. Donnelly with, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone on the porch. A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the backyard while wind chimes hanging beneath the roof swayed gently above them. Victoria broke the comfortable silence first. Can I ask you something personal? Ethan nodded. Of course. She looked toward the empty swing, moving slightly in the breeze. Do you ever think about getting married again? Ethan took his time before answering. I used to think I should find someone because Lily deserved another mother. He smiled faintly. Then one day, she told me she did not need someone perfect. She only hoped that if I ever loved someone again, she would be kind. Victoria felt her heart tighten. Children see things differently. They usually see them more clearly. Ethan rested his hands on the porch railing. Love should make a home feel safer, not more complicated. Victoria lowered her eyes. I have met many successful people. She paused, searching for words she had rarely spoken aloud. Most of them spent their lives chasing bigger houses, bigger companies, bigger titles. I'm starting to wonder whether I have been running in the wrong direction. Ethan looked at her with quiet understanding rather than surprise. There is nothing wrong with building something meaningful. He smiled gently. Just make sure you do not lose the people you hoped would celebrate it with you. Victoria inhaled slowly as those words settled deep inside her heart. At that exact moment, her phone began vibrating inside her jacket pocket. She glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the name of her executive assistant. 5 missed calls had already appeared beneath it, followed by dozens of urgent messages from members of the board. She quietly silenced the phone without reading them. Ethan noticed but said nothing. He respected the silence as much as he respected every story someone chose not to tell. Yet neither of them realized that somewhere inside a downtown conference room, a board member had just projected a photograph taken outside Bellamy House the previous evening. In the image, Victoria Hayes stood beneath the restaurant lights, smiling warmly at an ordinary carpenter as they shook hands. And before the afternoon was over, that single photograph would begin changing far more lives than either of them could possibly imagine. Victoria left Ethan's house just before sunset, carrying the little blue birdhouse Lily had insisted she take home because, as the little girl had explained with complete confidence, every lonely person deserved to hear birds sing outside their window. The drive back to downtown Chicago felt strangely unfamiliar. Towering office buildings slowly replaced quiet neighborhoods, and endless streams of traffic swallowed the peaceful silence she had experienced only minutes earlier. By the time she stepped into the headquarters of Hayes Technologies, the atmosphere had changed completely. The executive floor buzzed with tense conversations, hurried footsteps, and worried expressions. Her assistant, Melissa Grant, hurried toward her carrying a tablet and several printed reports. "Thank goodness you are here," Melissa said quietly. "The board has been waiting for over 2 hours." Victoria remained calm. "What happened?" Melissa hesitated before handing her the tablet. Across the screen was the very photograph taken outside Bellamy House. It showed Victoria smiling naturally while shaking hands with Ethan beneath the restaurant lights. The headline beneath it read, "Billionaire Chief Executive Officer Seen Spending Evening with Mystery Carpenter." Victoria studied the image without embarrassment. It was the first photograph of herself in years where her smile had not been carefully rehearsed. She handed the tablet back without comment and walked into the conference room. The conversations immediately stopped. 12 board members looked toward her with varying expressions of concern, confusion, and quiet disapproval. Richard Holloway, the senior chairman, adjusted his glasses before speaking first. "Victoria, perhaps you can explain why financial news outlets are asking whether the chief executive officer of this company has become romantically involved with a man no one can identify." Victoria calmly placed her notebook on the table. "His name is Ethan Brooks." Richard frowned. "Exactly. A carpenter." She nodded. "A very good one." Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Another executive leaned forward. "Investors are beginning to ask questions. They expect stability. Optics matter." Victoria looked around the room before answering. "Do you know what I find interesting?" No one replied. "Yesterday, none of you asked whether I was happy. Today, everyone is concerned about who made me smile." Silence slowly settled across the conference room. Richard folded his hands together. "This is not personal. This is business." Victoria met his gaze with quiet confidence. "That has been the problem for a very long time." She stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Thousands of people hurried along sidewalks far below, each carrying invisible burdens no balance sheet could measure. Without turning around, she spoke again. "Yesterday, I spent one afternoon with a father who earns in a year what some people in this room spend on a vacation. He never asked about my company. He never asked about my money. He only asked whether I had made it home safely." The room remained perfectly still. Victoria continued softly, "Tell me honestly, how many of you asked me that today?" No one answered, not because they disagreed, but because they could not. Richard finally cleared his throat. "We are only trying to protect the company." Victoria turned back toward the table with remarkable calm. "Then let us protect something even more valuable. Character." She gathered her notes and closed the meeting early, leaving several executives staring at one another in thoughtful silence. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan finished restoring the old rocking chair before loading it into his pickup truck for delivery. As he secured it with worn canvas straps, his phone rang. The restaurant manager from Bellamy House sounded unusually nervous. "Ethan," he said carefully, "you might want to turn on the news." Ethan looked puzzled. "Why?" The manager exhaled slowly. "Because somehow the whole city suddenly seems very interested in finding the carpenter who had dinner with the most powerful businesswoman in Chicago." 3 days later, the attention had only grown louder, but Ethan's life remained almost exactly the same. Every morning he packed Lily's lunch, tied her scarf against the cool October wind, and drove her to school in the same aging pickup truck that rattled faithfully through familiar streets. Reporters occasionally waited outside his workshop, hoping for a dramatic interview, but Ethan politely smiled, wished them a good day, and quietly returned to sanding old furniture that still deserved another chance. He refused to let unexpected attention steal the ordinary moments his daughter treasured most. Across the city, Victoria sat alone in her office long after the lights of Hayes Technologies had begun disappearing floor by floor. The little blue birdhouse Lily had painted rested beside the wide glass window overlooking Chicago. Every evening a pair of small sparrows landed on its tiny roof before flying away together. Victoria often found herself watching them instead of the endless stream of financial reports waiting on her desk. For the first time in years, success no longer felt like the finish line. It felt like an empty building after everyone else had gone home. Late Friday afternoon, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She canceled every remaining meeting, removed the nameplate from her conference room seat, picked up the little birdhouse, and quietly drove north. The autumn festival in Ethan's neighborhood had already begun. Children laughed while tossing leaves into the air. Local musicians played old American folk songs beneath strings of warm lights. The scent of cinnamon, fresh apple cider, and homemade pies drifted through the crisp evening air. Ethan stood beside a modest booth displaying handcrafted rocking chairs, cutting boards, and wooden toys, helping Lily explain to visitors how every birdhouse came with its own tiny story. Neither of them noticed Victoria until Lily suddenly looked toward the crowd and waved excitedly. "Daddy, our friend came back." Ethan turned and smiled with genuine surprise. Victoria walked toward them, carrying the little blue birdhouse, carefully wrapped in a cloth bag. "I think this belongs here," she said softly. Lily looked confused. Did the birds not like it? Victoria knelt beside her with a smile that carried warmth instead of sadness. "They loved it, but I think it was never really mine. It reminded me where I wanted to be." Lily accepted the birdhouse with both hands before hugging it against her jacket. She then looked up at Victoria with innocent certainty. "You do not look lonely anymore." Victoria laughed quietly, though her eyes shimmered with grateful emotion. She slowly turned toward Ethan. The sounds of the festival faded into the background as though the entire world had politely stepped aside. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. Ethan listened without speaking. Victoria drew one slow breath before continuing. "The night we met, I told you I wondered whether anyone would choose me if I had nothing." Ethan nodded gently. "I remember." Her voice grew softer. "I finally realized I was asking the wrong question. What I should have asked was whether I was willing to choose a life that could not be measured by money." She smiled through quiet tears that no longer came from heartbreak. "You answered that question without ever trying." Ethan stepped closer, his expression calm and kind exactly as it had been on the evening they first met. "Victoria," he said gently, "I never saw a billionaire sitting alone in that restaurant. I only saw someone who deserved to be treated with dignity." For several silent seconds, neither of them moved. Then Lily slipped her small hand into Victoria's and looked up at both adults with complete confidence. "Daddy always says home is wherever people keep showing up for each other." Ethan smiled as the evening breeze carried golden leaves gently across the festival grounds. Victoria squeezed Lily's hand before looking back at Ethan, no longer searching for perfect words because none were needed. Around them, conversations continued. Children laughed, and music floated through the cool autumn air. Yet inside that quiet moment, everything else seemed to disappear. Sometimes the greatest miracles never arrive in a limousine or inside a boardroom. Sometimes they arrive disguised as ordinary kindness, patiently waiting for two wounded hearts to recognize that love grows strongest where respect comes first, and in that peaceful silence, beneath the warm lights of a neighborhood festival, three lives quietly began their most beautiful chapter together.